Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. This week we have a very timely panel discussion on Belarus. It's not just the opposition that believes President Lukashenko stole the recent election through corruption. Even the European Union refuses to recognize the result. The resulting state repression and waves of protests and strikes has led to violence on the streets and the internet being closed down entirely for several days. Although it may not be immediately obvious, Belarus has a thriving IT sector, and there's several companies focused on CX tech, such as robotic process automation. I assembled an extremely knowledgeable group of people to ask about the effect of this situation on Belarus society in general and the impact we might see on the tech and CX sectors. Peter Ryan is the principal at Ryan Strategic Advisory, based in Montreal, Canada. Andrew Roble is the founder of Emerging Europe, a London-based intelligence, news and community platform, although Andrew is speaking here from Malta as he's been effectively trapped there for several months during the lockdown. Michael Zanowski is the head of energy and environment at the corporate communications specialist Modano, based in London. Although Michael's speaking here more in his personal capacity as someone who's lived and worked in Russia, his doctorate was even focused on Russian speakers in Estonia. All three of these experts know Belarus and the region, and I'm grateful they could all jump on this call to give their insight and ideas. Go ahead and introduce yourselves. Let's start with Peter Ryan.
Mark, thank you very much. Great to be here, and I am honored to be participating with my friends Michael and Andrew today. Peter Ryan is the name, and I am the principal analyst at Ryan Strategic Advisory in Canada.
And Andrew Robo?
Yeah, so my name is Andrew Roble. I am the founding partner of Emerging Europe, which is a news, intelligence, and community platform focused on 23 countries of Central and Eastern Europe, including Belarus.
And I'm Michael Stanowski. By profession, I'm an energy communications specialist, but I'm also a Russian and Central and Eastern European specialist with an academic background on Russia and the former Soviet Union.
And I know, Michael, that you wrote your doctorate about the Soviet Union, didn't you?
I did indeed. I wrote a doctorate many moons ago about the Russian-speaking minority in the Baltic states, which obviously is very, very close to Belarus. And indeed, many of the Russian speakers I got to know in Estonia and Latvia actually had relatives in Belarus and would regularly travel between the countries.
Okay, and let's kick off with you, Michael, anyway then. Before this recent news and the recent protests about the election, Belarus was pretty much under the radar for most people. Why is there's so much attention, particularly around the business community? Why is there so much attention now?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons, Mark. Firstly, Belarus is one of those countries that a lot of us have heard about, but actually very few people know about. It's a country hidden away in Central and Eastern Europe between Poland and Russia. A few of us know the few basic facts about Belarus, and one of those is that they've got a long-standing leader, an authoritarian leader, Alexander Lukashenko, who's been in power since 1994, which is a heck of a long time, and he is one of those real examples of, and this may sound disparaging, some people don't like this term, but Homo Sovieticus, so a person who was formed and his opinions formed in the Soviet Union. He was a former collective farm director before becoming president, and in many cases his views still reflect that Soviet past, and I think a lot of people are interested to see if the Belarusian regime in its current form will continue, or will there be a change of direction? And therefore it's tremendously exciting for those of us who are interested in the Cold War and with memories of 1989.
Excellent. Well, Andrew, I know that Emerging Europe recently published an article that actually looked at how business leaders over there are being affected, and particularly in the IT, tech and startup area. How can these people be running a business there if the leadership can just switch the internet on and off at will?
So I'll answer your question in a second, but I would like to relate to what Michael was saying a moment ago about how much people know about Belarus. And I remember speaking to my Polish friends a couple of years ago when I came back to London from a trip to Minsk, and they were saying, you're going again to Belarus, aren't you afraid? So I showed them a video, and they're from Poland. And, one of it's a couple, he works for a national television network, and she's quite a known actress in Poland. And, their sort of knowledge or awareness about Belarus was like close to nothing. Now, when we're talking about the current situation, yes, right after the election last week, we had 2 days with literally no internet. So basically, mobile phones were not working either. The only thing that Belarusians used was actually Telegram, which is a sort of local something close to Facebook. I don't know if you are familiar with that. But so we spoke to a number of different CEOs and IT specialists in Belarus, and they were really affected by the whole situation there. Some of them were simply not able to contact their clients abroad, so they had to be very creative, coming up with VPN and using that to connect with their clients. A lot of them basically lost a chance to send a proposal. Even, I mean, it was just 2 days, but still quite a lot of time. There were people who were unable to perform their tasks, basically. Even our company, uses a company based out of Minsk, and we were unable to connect with them for 2 days. It is estimated that about 50, the cost of that, internet disruption is estimated at about $55.5 million US per day. So that is a huge amount. And obviously, I know we're going to talk about the country's image and how that translates a little bit later, but I think it has been quite detrimental for the business.
Yeah, thanks. And Peter, I mean, I know that you know some companies there and you've been over there. I mean, what have you been hearing about the current situation from some of the companies or individuals that you know in the region?
Mark, you're right. I have visited Belarus a number of times and truly enjoyed my time there. What I would say I have heard from individuals who I know on the ground, people who are personal friends of mine as well as professional contacts, is that the situation is very tense. I think that a lot of what we're seeing on TV truly does reflect the reality of what's going on. And when you have professional people who are educated, who are exposed to the rest of the world through travel, both business travel and leisure travel, who are legitimately trying to express their concern with the direction of the country, that are being arrested and physically beaten by the authorities for having expressed their opinions and expressed a desire for change. This is very, very symptomatic of a country that has got a lot of negativity that's been boiling under the surface from a governmental standpoint. Now, what I think that we need to consider going forward is the direction that Belarus is going to take in terms of obviously bringing more transparency into the equation, but also the extent to which individuals will be able to express their opinions, be able to express themselves politically, and be able to give an idea about where they want the country to go. That direction will invariably have a big impact on the business climate and investor confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, Michael, you mentioned that effectively Lukashenko has run the country since independence in the early 90s. But it seems that compared to many of the other former Soviet states, it just hasn't developed along the same path. It still appears to be much more culturally Russian rather than attached to the European Union. So is there any appetite to get closer to the EU, or is Russia pulling harder on Belarus?
Yeah, I think I'll just pick up on your point there about Belarus being culturally much closer to Russia than the other countries around it. I think that's absolutely right. Though there is a Belarusian language, the language that you'll hear throughout the country is Russian. I think most Belarusians have friends and family right across Russia, so there's strong links there. And also some of the symbols that are present in Russia around the Soviet victory in the Second World War are celebrated in in Belarus with equal enthusiasm. And therefore, it's not like the situation in Ukraine where many people and some of the elites wanted to pivot to the European Union. That sort of desire to pivot westwards hasn't been present in Belarus. And actually, it's quite interesting with regard to what's happening now, because you don't see European Union flags being waved on the streets. It's very much a protest against Lukashenko. And I think that's quite wise, and I think a deliberate strategy by the leaders of the opposition in Belarus, because, of course, what was so crucial about the Ukrainian conflict in 2014, and which continues to this day, is that it really brought Russia's ira to the fore, because they could see a country that was slipping westwards and might pivot westwards and might become a democracy, and therefore that becomes a problem to Russia. Whereas Belarus, I think the opposition have played it much more adeptly, and are focusing on leveraging Lukashenko out of power, and that presents Russia with quite a difficult conundrum, because they clearly don't want a fully fledged Western democracy on their doorstep, but that's not really what the opposition are looking for right at this moment. They just want to see Lukashenko gone, and the election result, or whatever form it turned out to be, because it's obviously disputed. They want to see that investigated and fresh light being brought on that.
Yeah, and that's interesting, the idea of democracy and how that's valued. Andrew, I wanted to ask your opinion on that, because we can see that the actual candidate that stood against Lukashenko ended up in jail. His wife...
Quite a few of them, actually.
Right, and I was thinking of Sergei Tikhanovsky. He ended up in jail. His wife, Svetlana, ended up running against Lukashenko in his place, and she's actually now in exile in Lithuania. And I think only today, this morning, as we're recording this, Lukashenko's now launched a criminal case against any political opposition. So, how do you maintain any kind of pretense of democracy when you just jail or force everybody out of the country?
Well, I don't think we can talk about democracy at all, pretty much there. What was this happened a couple of days ago when I saw Lukashenko, making a speech to a handful of people that he brought throughout the country, and still some of them were chanting, "Ukhadi," which means go away, and he said what he had to say anyway, and then he said, at the end, now I have finished, you can continue chanting Ukhadi. That is, for me, this shows this disrespect for actually the people who have theoretically, at least, chosen him as the next president, and also arrogance, because this is incredible, actually.
Yeah. And Peter, what is this doing to the business reputation of Belarus? We've both been there. We've visited together as well. And I can name half a dozen different companies that have a major international reputation. But how would you feel about doing business there now?
Well, the reality is, at the time we're recording this podcast, I think that further inward investment into Belarus is quite frankly unrealistic. I don't believe that any international company is going to want to do more business in a country that is rife with protest, where there's clear abuse of power at the top of the chain. And there doesn't seem to be any type of an end game in sight in terms of where this is going. Now, that's not to say that I think that an end game is not necessarily in view. I do believe that we will see some type of regime change in Belarus in the not too distant future. But right now, it's very cloudy what that's going to look like. But the reality is, and I think it was Andrew who said this earlier on, that he had friends who were concerned about his safety when he visited Belarus. I had the very same thing the first time that I went with yourself a few years ago to visit companies in Minsk. People were acutely concerned about what we were going to be treated like, about how we were going to find the political atmosphere, what was going to be the situation in terms of our ability to move around freely. Now, the reality was, when I visited Belarus on any of the occasions, I've never had an issue. In fact, I've been very warmly greeted. But there's also a sense that the country has not necessarily improved its reputation when it comes to not just the broader community, but certainly the business community. What we're seeing on the ground right now is not going to help. And until we get a clear idea about where this is going to evolve to, I don't see any further interest amongst any organization to put further any, whether it's euros or dollars, into Belarus.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting now because, Michael, I wanted to ask about obviously it's like reading the future, but the potential outcomes. I mean, what would be the best outcome? It almost feels like a military coup might be the best possible outcome now to actually sort of underline the situation.
Well, I think there are a couple of key players within this. There's obviously the opposition, which if they continue to keep going and continue to be able to mobilize people and continue to be able to shut down parts of the Belarus economy, I think that they've got a strong lever. And what they've done so successfully over the past 12 days or so is mobilize people and get people out on the streets. And this has been an enormous shock to Lukashenko and obviously to Russia. I think the other key player is obviously Russia itself. I mean, Russia and Putin and Lukashenko have had a largely good and warm relationship over the years, but there have been several bumps in the road. And indeed, prior to this election, Lukashenko said that 200 Russians had been sent by Putin to destabilize Belarus. So I think that doesn't play well with Moscow, and Moscow really is big brother in that neighborhood. It won't want to see Belarus slip away to the west or become increasingly unstable. So I think the actual what might be on the table in a likely scenario is, if the protests continue, the opposition continues to really have a strong backbone and galvanize significant parts of the economy and population, then there might be a controlled succession that might be guided by Moscow. But again, this is all supposition. But I think if you were to look at a logical sequence of events, that might be the most likely logical sequence.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Andrew, I know that you've been in touch with several people in the kind of IT, tech, and CX industries recently. I mean, how are they coping? I mean, right now, and what are they saying?
Well, the situation has improved since, the internet, was turned back on, so to speak. So I think it's much better. But I would like to look at a sort of broader picture and maybe also stay a little bit more positive about the image of the country, because right now, after all those decades of sort of negative of this negative image of Belarus, we are seeing something very positive there, and I think that is it's something different from the British media, for example, the Sun or the Daily Mail, talking about Steven Seagal giving watermelons to Lukashenko, because this is what our media outlets usually covered when they talked about Belarus. I have recently seen a picture of a small group of Belarusians standing on a bench, outside, and sort of looking at the what was happening around, and they had taken off their shoes, and there was someone, there was a caption there saying that these are Canadians in Europe, actually. So saying that it's like looking at the country from a different perspective, which I think is very positive, and I hope that that will stay on, and Belarus will be able to build on that.
Yeah, I mean, quite often the normal media coverage in Western Europe immediately opens with last dictatorship in Europe. And so I think
pretty much every single article starts with that. And I also remember this panel discussion that I took part in 2016, which was, quite a while ago. And we were talking about the image of Belarus. And I like sort of bringing up this chat that I had with a former CEO of HSBC in Poland. And when we were talking about, the image of Poland in the UK, for example, he said that, an average British person would see or sees Poland as something that Poland looked like between 5 and 30 years ago. So I mentioned that, on the panel, and there was this one Belarusian guy who said, well, it's not true. We are seen abroad as a fantastic country with with an excellent IT sector and so on and so on. So, you need to contrast these two visions.
Okay, great. And Peter and Michael, then, just any final thoughts before we close on, what you see as maybe the best outcome, but particularly for the kind of global tech and IT community that we see?
I really think that the best outcome would be some type of transition towards a stable and more transparent government that is going to be chosen legitimately by the Belarus voters. Now, look, at the end of the day, I think that we all realize that capital prefers stability. Capital prefers some type of an idea about where a country is going to be going so that they can plan accordingly. And I think that Andrew raised a couple of really good points there about the fact that there is very much a booming industry in Belarus when it comes to technology. And a lot of organizations have been working with Belarus agencies to try and foster different elements of their CX technology stack. They've got a tremendous track record in this regard. And it would be a real shame to see all that work that's been plowed in over the course of the past 10, 15 years come to naught because they weren't able to come to some type of resolution. So my clear hope is that there can be some type of a deal reached in which the country can move forward in a transparent and democratic fashion, and that investment will continue to flow in, and that Belarus will continue to develop as a member of the global economy.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Peter's said there, and just sort of a couple of final thoughts. I mean, getting back to that point that Lukashenko has been in power since '94, you would have to be well into your mid-30s to have any recollection of any other person leading the country or the system other than Lukashenko if you were Belarusian. So I think that, whatever happens in Belarus, it has to have a system and a leadership that reflects the population and not the Soviet past. And to go with that, the fundamental building block has to be respect for human rights. And as we've seen over the last couple of weeks with unlawful detentions and torture in the country, that clearly has to stop. And I completely agree with Peter that for business to be, for Belarus to be integrated into the world economy, there has to be respect for those human rights and a system that reflects the will of the people.
And I think that the Belarusians definitely deserve that, if I can finish.
Agreed. Absolutely,
yeah.
They do.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. Please take a moment to review the podcast because this helps other listeners to find it. And if you have any suggestions, then get in touch with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm @Mark Hillary with 2 L's, or just search Google for Mark Hillary.